Alright, it's time for part 8 of this audience Q&A series. If you have a question you'd like answered next time, leave it in the comments section of this video. I've got an entire playlist dedicated to this Q&A series, and there's a chance your question may have already been answered, so make sure to check those videos out when you have the chance. But for now, let's jump right into this latest batch of your questions. Lance asks, how would you write an interaction between classic-era Parallax and Cyborg Superman? I'd risk a time travel story, but only if it pulled off situations that reasonably challenge both characters in their primes. I think Hal should always react to Cyborg Superman the way Kyle reacts to Major Force. This monster took everything, destroyed millions of lives, and I can't believe that Hal is okay with the idea of him roaming free. They did have a final showdown right before Hal reignited the sun in Final Night, but it was lacking something. Hal is always so in control, even when he's flustered. I think seeing Cyborg Superman should bring back the flood of emotions Hal felt when Coast City was destroyed, and it should be impossible for Hal to maintain his cool in a fight against Cyborg Superman. So if Hal, as pre-entity Parallax, got to fight Cyborg Superman one more time, I think he'd want to make sure Cyborg Superman never hurt anyone ever again, while forcing Cyborg Superman to feel the impact of his own atrocity. Hal would take Cyborg Superman back in time and drop him in the center of Coast City in the moments before its destruction and trap Cyborg Superman in a time loop where he blows up along with Coast City over and over again forever. Bruh Gamer asks, what are your thoughts about the corpse in Green Lantern Corps, and do you think it might ever be brought back? I love the idea of the corpse. It makes sense that the Green Lantern Corps would have a Black Ops unit, and a lot of thought was put into the way a group like that would have to operate. They first appeared back in 2007 in Green Lantern Corps numbers 7, 8, and 9, and then they actually came back in 2014 in Green Lantern Corps numbers 28 to 34 as part of the Uprising crossover with the main Green Lantern book. This was the war between the Green Lanterns and the shape-shifting Durlans, and since the leader of the Corps is Von Daggle, a Durlan who's a Green Lantern, it only made sense to bring him back to play a part. The story left us with some unanswered questions about the fate of Daggle's partner, Ramey Hall, who we met back in 2007, so hopefully we'll get resolution to that at some point in the future. Camille Scherzanowski asks, in the final episode of Young Justice Phantoms, we saw a tease of Daxam, and that would be a great chance to introduce Earth-16's version of Sodam Yat as a prominent character of the season. If you were the writer, how would you introduce him in the series? Would you down-age him to be around 18 to 19 Earth years old as a way to fit in with the rest of the cast? And with Sodam, would you introduce Arisia as well? I think Sodam Yat's story works really well if we make him a teenager. He's one of the only open-minded people in a society of bigots. The whole world tells him that aliens are bad and should be hated and feared, but he doesn't believe it, and wants to go out into space to see for himself. The desire to rebel against authority is a key aspect of Sodam's past, and that maps really cleanly onto a young person defying their parents. He'd defy authority, venture out into space, and the first person he meets would be Arisia. If we fudge things a little bit more and have Arisia still be a teenage Green Lantern when Sodam meets her, then we've got a solid Romeo and Juliet inspired story where an alien girl from an intergalactic organization that embraces diversity falls in love with a boy from a xenophobic planet that hates all aliens. It basically writes itself from there. A couple here from Masquerade Noir. If you could pick 7 Pokemon characters for the various Lantern Corps, considering all of their canons and games and anime and manga, and if you want, you can include characters from the Detective Pikachu film. So my Red Lantern would be Mewtwo. All he wants is to be left alone so he and the other clone Pokemon can live in peace. But people keep hunting him down and trying to catch or control or destroy him. He is right to hate humans, and I kind of can't blame him for lashing out. He doesn't want to be full of rage, but the world just keeps provoking him. Now, my Orange Lantern was hard to pin down, because just about everybody in this entire franchise is obsessed with gaining something. But I settled on Go. This kid takes the old gotta catch 'em all slogan way too seriously. He decided on a whim that he wanted to catch every Pokemon in the world, and he eventually wants his partner Pokemon to be Mew, who's like the rarest Pokemon ever. And at first, Go doesn't even care about training the Pokemon he catches. He just wants to fill out that Pokedex and cross more names off the list. He doesn't even battle, he just starts throwing Pokeballs the instant he sees a Pokemon and doesn't stop until one of them catches it. And I get that he's meant to represent Pokemon Go, a game where you literally play by just throwing Pokeballs when a wild Pokemon appears. But while that makes sense for gameplay, it's a pretty troubling basis for a character. Thankfully, Go does get some personal growth along the way, and he does start behaving more like an actual trainer, but he's still way too focused on that original goal for my liking. My Yellow Lantern is Leon, the unbeatable champion who crushes even the strongest challengers. Leon is in an odd position because the success that's come to define him is what scares him the most. Leon is the champion, he's at the very top, and if nobody can beat him, it means there's nowhere left to go. Growing and changing and becoming stronger alongside his Pokemon is what gives his life joy and meaning, but he's already surpassed everyone, so what is it all worth now? I think for my Green Lantern, I'll go with B, the fighting-type gym leader, and one of the many challengers who lost to Leon. B is probably the most determined Pokemon trainer I've seen so far, and in this franchise that's really saying something. If she's got a goal that seems out of reach, she'll run straight towards it at top speed, head first, and deal with the consequences later. This is the kind of person who'd rather jump out of a helicopter instead of waiting for it to land. And when she trains her Pokemon, she doesn't just train them, she trains with them. She is their opponent. They spar all day and night, rain or shine. My Blue Lantern is Dawn, who manages to stay positive no matter how many times it may seem like her dream is out of reach. And I mean, come on, her catchphrase is "no need to worry," which is literally the same thing as saying all will be well. My Indigo Lantern is Nurse Joy. She's compassionate, she heals, she pops up everywhere as if she could teleport. It just fits. And my Violet Lantern is Lusamine, who lost her husband when he vanished while studying interdimensional portals. Her desire to get him back morphed into an unhealthy fixation on portals and the creatures that traverse them, and severely warped her relationship with her children. Honestly, she reminds me a lot of the Zamarons, who got their hearts broken and then took it out on the rest of the universe. Lusamine even keeps a collection of Pokemon that she's frozen in ice to preserve their beauty forever, which is almost exactly like what the Zamarons ordered the Star Sapphire Corps to do on a planetary level, by sealing entire worlds in crystal to eternally preserve the love found there. If you've played Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, what Lantern Corps do you think the three main characters of the game, Nimona, Arven, and Penny, would be part of? I think Nimona would be a Green Lantern, Arven Blue, and Penny a Star Sapphire. I unfortunately don't know who those characters are, since I haven't played Scarlet and Violet. I wanted to, but I'm not willing to spend my time and money on a game with so many bugs. Maybe I'll get around to them once all the technical problems are fixed, but by that point it'll probably be time for a whole new generation anyway. Khalid Sarad asks, what are the limits of a Lantern Ring constructs? Like, could they make liquid or elemental power? What about magic power? And how detailed would their constructs be? They can do elemental stuff. Fire, water, electricity, though most of the time they're not actually making those elements, just constructs with the physical properties of those elements. You could probably make a construct lighter that sparks an actual non-construct flame, but it's way easier to just go with fake green construct fire that gets you the same results. Can the ring make magic? No, it can't. Willpower and magic are made of different stuff, so you can't make magic out of willpower, if that makes sense. Besides, the Guardians hate magic. They'd never create a ring that could make more of it. Cat Lawyer Will Defend for Treats wants to know, curious what you thought about DC vs. Vampires and his treatment of Hal. I feel like a canonical vampire story would be great for Green Lantern, since it'll be light versus dark. If you want a good story about a Green Lantern fighting vampires, you should read Green Lantern Corps Quarterly number 7. It's an anthology book, and the story Ashes to Ashes is the first appearance of the Green Lantern named Ash, who has to deal with vampires plaguing his homeworld. As for DC vs. Vampires, I think their treatment of Hal was mostly okay, but it really gets muddled by the fact that the story has no clear idea about how vampires work. Vampires are so different across pop culture that you really can't just assume any pre-existing knowledge is accurate when starting an entirely new vampire story, and DC vs. Vampires was so disinterested in laying out the rules that it's hard to tell what's lazy writing, what's plot armor, and what's adhering to rules that we don't know. I will say though, Hal's final scene in this series is a really good moment between him and Ollie that I like a lot. York Lane asks, what do you think of the idea of connecting Argent from the Teen Titans to the Green Lanterns, since they have similar powers to my knowledge? Like making her some kind of anomaly that's somehow connected to the emotional spectrum, and maybe making her into a sidekick for Green Lantern. That would be great, especially right now. Between Hal being stuck on Earth and the Titans becoming such a big deal, it seems like the perfect time to bring Argent back and have her seek out a Green Lantern for training. I don't know what the status is of the Titans Academy or other branches like Titans East, but if they were ever going to bring back Argent in a big way, now is the time. York Lane also asks, what do you think of the idea of two rings combining into one and accessing some new kind of emotional power? For example, a blue and green ring fusing to form an aqua or teal ring that accesses an aqua or teal light which acts as a sort of middle ground between blue and green. I think it has a lot of potential. Like, we already know that indigo rings of compassion can reach out, touch, and mimic other powers in the spectrum, so what if the indigos accidentally become some sort of nexus point, where the rest of the spectrum starts to bleed into each other? What happens when equal amounts of fear and willpower mix? Would the green or yellow rings even be able to function, since the two powers have opposite requirements for their use? Would combining blue and red rings cure the Red Lanterns of their rage, or make them more motivated than ever to get their revenge? This line of thinking leads to so many cool ideas. Hopefully we'll get to see it happen someday. Trevor Smith asks, with the upcoming Blue Beetle movie and Green Lantern show, I think a lot more people are going to realize just how similar scarabs are to power rings. Their functions are so similar that I wouldn't at all be surprised if the Reach based their Scarab Warriors on Green Lanterns. All that to ask, do you think the Reach should play a bigger role as an antagonistic group for the Green Lantern Corps? To my knowledge, the Reach has only interacted with the GLC mythos twice, once when they signed a treaty with the Guardians, and once when the Reach decimated the Blue Lantern Corps. It's funny, the way I've been describing Blue Beetle to people is by saying, what if Iron Man was Spider-Man? But you're right, there are a lot of similarities to the Green Lanterns, to the point that it's honestly kind of weird that they haven't interacted more. The Reach becoming a major Green Lantern Corps enemy seems like the most natural thing in the world. We know they've been in conflict in the past, which is presumably the reason why the Reach goes out of its way to lie and manipulate world leaders into accepting them. If they just invaded, the Green Lanterns could come and kick them off the planet. Between their manipulative way of conquering worlds, and the way they decimated the Blue Lantern homeworld, I think it should only be a matter of time before we get a major storyline pitting the Lanterns against the Reach. Trevor Smith also asks, would you be interested in a character who accesses the emotional spectrum purely through magic? Specifically channeling the power of the entities. I'm imagining a character who shouts out incantations like Doctor Strange does, with an example being the embrace of the proselyte. Yeah, that would be cool, and we're already part of the way there. The Red Lanterns tap into the emotional spectrum with the use of ritualistic blood magic, and there's a Green Lantern named Torquemada who had already been training in the mystic arts before he got his ring. I'm kind of surprised the Guardians let him stick around, considering how anti-magic they are. And remember, Green Lantern Guy Gardner spent a long time as a Red Lantern, and there were a few times when he had to tap into the supernatural aspect of the ring's power. So there are plenty of characters who could probably achieve what you're talking about, either by themselves or working together. This might actually make a really good Justice League Dark story. Harry Lipscomb wants to know, which Green Lantern villain would you least like to meet in real life? Do the Xenomorphs count? In terms of classic villains, I have to go with Hector Hammond. A malicious telepath with free access to my mind sounds absolutely horrific. A Man Chooses, a Slave Obeys wants to know, I'd love to know what rings you would give to the Quiet Council of Krakoa, including former members. And as a twist, since there are so many Omega-level mutants, I'd like to see a reasoning not just as to why, but how they would be impaired in strength with the rings, just so they don't become more broken than they already are. So the Quiet Council are the political leaders of the mutant nation of Krakoa. It's a very long and involved and interesting story of intrigue and backstabbing, which we will talk about sooner or later. But for right now, I have to give rings to like 17 people. And I like the added detail of the rings needing to hinder them in some way. So let's see. Professor Xavier would be a Blue Lantern, since so much of his existence has revolved around his belief in a better future being attainable in his lifetime. The thing is, in order to build the new mutant nation, Xavier had to give up on some aspects of that dream. He's helping mutant kind take some truly great strides forward, but he's compromising some of his own beliefs to do it. You don't get the nation of Krakoa without first admitting that mutants can't peacefully coexist with humans, and that is a major blow to everything Xavier has ever stood for. So he would have a blue ring, but he'd have a very hard time using it. Remember what it was like for Hal during the Agent Orange story? Or that period of time when St. Walker lost hope and his ring just hovered near him. Something like that. Magneto would be a Yellow Lantern. No matter what he does or how much he's changed, this is still the same person who's launched large-scale attacks on entire nations and been the face of a violent revolutionary movement. The world is always going to be afraid of Magneto, and while that would actually give him quite a lot of power by qualifying him for a yellow ring, it would also mean he's pretty far away from achieving his goal, especially in the Krakoa era, when the mutant nation is trying to secure their own place among the global community. There's no room for a powerful fearmonger in the world Krakoa is trying to build. Apocalypse would be a Star Sapphire. The Krakoa era gives a lot of context to the backstory of Apocalypse, why he fights, where he came from, and who he left behind. He's trying to recreate what he once had, and get back the family that was ripped away from him so long ago. None of this suddenly makes him one of the good guys, or excuses anything he's done, but love isn't reserved solely for good people. I think Apocalypse would resent the ring's power for trying to fill the void in his heart, and keeping the ring would only make him feel like he's betraying the memory of his loved ones. Emma Frost would be a Yellow Lantern. She gives me Sinestro vibes in general. She's been a villain, she's been a hero, she always seems to have a plan brewing just below the surface, and nobody's ever sure if they can trust her. And I'm sure she'd be able to work the ring into her wardrobe in a classy way. The downside is that the ring would always key into the fears of other people, making it difficult for her telepathy to read anything else. Sebastian Shaw would be an Orange Lantern. He's entirely out for himself and is willing to kill anyone who gets in his way, even his own business partners. Shaw's power is to absorb any kind of energy into his own body, which increases his physical strength and durability. With an orange ring on his finger, Shaw's greed would be amplified exponentially, and all of that greed would be turned into power, and his body would try to absorb that power, until he either dies or at least does permanent damage to his body. Kate Pryde would be a Green Lantern. Between her intangibility and her ninja training, she really has no reason not to just jump in headfirst into trouble and see what happens. Give her a power ring on top of that, and she'd probably become even more reckless, to the point that she becomes a danger to herself and others. Storm is a Green Lantern. She exudes power, leadership, and dependability. Honestly, I think she's perfect for this. The problem is that in the past, Storm has fallen into the trap of believing her own hype, and thinking of herself as an actual goddess, before being brought back down to Earth. The power of a Green Lantern ring on top of her control of the forces of nature could pretty easily bring that out in her again. Nightcrawler would be a Blue Lantern, and just like Storm, he's a perfect fit. The problem is I don't think he'd like the way the ring presents concepts like hope and belief as something a computer algorithm can quantify and judge. Ultimately, I think being a Blue Lantern would clash with his faith enough that he'd end up releasing the ring. Jean Grey would be a White Lantern. She's come back from the dead before, and now she'd have the opportunity to undo all of the deaths caused by the Dark Phoenix. But since entire worlds died at the hands of the Phoenix, this would also condemn Jean to endless restitution, and undo all of the progress she's made in building a real life for herself. Mystique would be a Star Sapphire, since she was willing to burn the entire mutant nation to the ground to get her wife back, but she'd likely succumb to the influence of the ring. It can be easy to forget, since the Star Sapphire we spend the most time with is Carol Ferris, who's built up a strong resistance after years of exposure, but the Sapphire rings are designed to keep you brainwashed into serving the goals and ideology of the Zamarons. Mystique would get the woman she loves back, but she'd lose something of herself in the process. Exodus would be a Blue Lantern. He becomes even more powerful when he believes in himself, or other people believe in him. The light of the blue ring could amplify that belief, bringing it to the surface, theoretically making Exodus even more powerful, but it could wildly backfire if the people he bathes in the blue light don't actually want him to succeed, in which case using a blue ring could cut him off from potential power by revealing the true nature of what the people around him actually hope for. Mr. Sinister is an Orange Lantern. He's so self-centered, most of his plans involve dozens of clones of himself. The fatal flaw here is obvious. There's one ring and 100 Sinister clones that would fight to the death over it. Destiny would be a Green Lantern, and she would gain access to the same Emerald Sight that gave Simon Baz visions of the future. Only those visions would be very, very different from what her own natural precognition powers tell her, and it would result in Destiny not knowing what to believe. Colossus would be a Star Sapphire. He's at his best when he's putting everything on the line for the people he loves the most, whether it means jumping in front of a tractor to save his little sister, or sacrificing himself to find a cure for the legacy virus. Add in the relationship drama with Kitty, and you've got the perfect blend of love and tragedy to qualify him for a Violet Ring. Hope Summers seems obvious. I mean, her name is Hope, right? Well, she'd get a Red Lantern ring. She was raised in a post-apocalyptic future by Cable, of all people. You don't come out of that as a calm, well-adjusted person. Hope's main job in the Krakoa era was to help resurrect dead mutants, a very delicate process that involves working closely with her team. With the red ring making her emotionally unstable, Hope's ability to participate in the process would be nearly impossible, making resurrections far too risky to even try. Selene would get a Black Lantern ring and raise an army of the dead just like she did in the Necrosha storyline, but would be at a complete loss when the Black Lanterns obey their programming instead of her commands. Cypher isn't technically a member of the Council, but he sits in on meetings since he's the only one who can communicate with the sentient island of Krakoa where they all live. Cypher would be an Indigo Lantern. The ability to reach out and compassionately understand the feelings of others would seem like a natural fit for his power to translate all language. But the thing about the Indigo Rings is that the emotion they replicate is artificial. It's not a real connection, it's just close enough to get the job done. And I think that would ultimately hurt Cypher's ability to understand others, since it'll keep him from seeing what they're really like. We've got a few here from Rex 10. If you could give 11 members of the Justice League any Lantern Corps ring, who would you pick and what ring would you give them? 11 members, huh? I'm going to assume that you picked that number to correspond with the 7 emotional spectrum rings, plus white and black, gold, and ultraviolet. And just to make it more interesting, I'm going to try my best to only pick characters who have never worn lantern rings before. Except Black Lantern rings. Pretty much everybody wore a black ring before. A red ring would go to Billy Batson, specifically because of the gods he's connected to. The power of Shazam comes from 6 godlike figures who each contribute some power to their champion. So what if the Red Lantern ring uses that connection to draw out the fury of the gods through their champion? What would that do to the mind and body of a mortal? Could a Red Lantern ring even handle all of that rage? What happens when Billy says the magic word? Does it all just stop? If he takes the ring off, does that have a negative effect on the gods? So many questions. This would be a lot of fun. An orange ring would go to Power Girl. So much of her life has been about losing her home and having to find a new one, losing her identity and having to find a new one, and getting some semblance of her old life back only to lose it all over again. She wishes she could have it all back, and an orange ring could very easily manipulate those feelings, while also making her very resentful and jealous of Supergirl. A yellow ring would go to Major Disaster. Yes, the Green Lantern villain. He's gone back and forth between being a hero and a villain a few times, and joined several incarnations of the Justice League. His powers literally cause natural disasters like earthquakes, tornadoes, and volcano eruptions. It must be genuinely hard for him to use his powers without scaring the hell out of everyone in range. A green ring would go to Black Canary. I don't even know what else to say. Black Canary rules. You do not mess with Black Canary. A blue ring would go to Mr. Terrific, who believes that there's no limit to what humanity can achieve through scientific ingenuity. An indigo ring would go to Lex Luthor. Yes, he was a member of the Justice League. No, he is not a compassionate person. And that's exactly why the indigo ring would imprison and attempt to reform him. A violet ring would go to Wally West, the Flash. He is all about his family. There is literally nothing he would not or could not do for his family. A black ring would go to Jason Blood. He's a centuries-old occult expert whose soul is bonded to the demon Etrigan. If anyone could use the power of a black ring for some bizarre, morally dubious necromancy, it's him. A white ring would go to Vixen, who already draws power from a natural connection to most other living things. Gold is a tough one, because at the time of this recording, we still don't know what gold is. Just that it's the Lantern Corps that works with the Legion in the future. So I'm going with Captain Atom, whose nuclear powers make him prone to exploding, and those explosions sometimes launch him through time or the multiverse. So it would be easy for him to end up in the future and start working with that era's superheroes until he can find a way home. And finally, I'd make Booster Gold an Ultraviolet Lantern, because he puts on a brave face to bury the truth of both his shameful past and the actual heroic deeds that are only possible because everyone thinks he's nothing but a joke. What is something that you would change about all the Lantern Corps? I think each Lantern Corps needs a new mission statement, a specific goal that drives them and pushes them forward. It's way too easy to go back to basics with the classic status quo of these corps, especially when some of them haven't been seen for years. Look at the Red Lanterns, for example. Under the leadership of Atrocitus, the Red Lantern Corps used to exist solely to exact revenge. Then, when Guy Gardner took over, the Reds became all about fighting on behalf of people who couldn't stand up for themselves. When Guy left, he told the remaining Red Lanterns to make the Corps into whatever they think it should be. And that's where we left it. Since then, we've seen Red Lanterns make cameo appearances here and there, and the presence of Atrocitus seems to imply that the Corps has been reset to its classic status quo, which would be very disappointing since they've come so far and were poised to evolve into something new. If you could create your own Dark Justice League team made of villains and antiheroes like the Dark Avengers from Marvel, who would you pick and why? So this is interesting. The Dark Avengers was a team of villains and anti-heroes masquerading as heroes who they had something in common with. Venom was Spider-Man, Bullseye was Hawkeye, that sort of thing. So for a DC equivalent, I think I'd go with Ocean Master impersonating Aquaman. This whole thing would be his idea. He's tried to attack the surface world directly multiple times and failed, so this time he wants to do it covertly, by becoming our hero and earning our trust before toppling our civilization from the inside. The fascinating thing about teams like this is that while they are absolutely working towards a terrible goal, the only way they can achieve it is by doing real superhero work, helping people and saving lives. Their Flash equivalent will be the Rival, an enemy of the Golden Age Flash Jay Garrick. This is probably the easiest one since he already has super speed and dresses exactly like the Flash, so they wouldn't really have to change anything beyond getting him to behave himself. Their Batman would be Catman, a mercenary with a code of honor who hates superheroes for being arrogant. Ocean Master would straight up lie to get him to join, saying that the purpose of this team is to replace the Justice League with something that stays true to the core idealistic values of what heroes should be. Blackfire would impersonate her sister Starfire. She's always looking for leverage that would help her become the leader of her people, and helping Ocean Master become the king of Earth would give her a very powerful ally. Now, I think teams like this are the most interesting when you anchor them with one legit out-and-out superhero. Someone who can further the villain's agenda by giving the team credibility, while also struggling with the questionable morality of what the team is doing. That's where Jessica Cruz, aka Yellow Lantern, comes in. Her time in the Sinestro Corps has shown her that concepts like hero and villain aren't as black and white as people think. So she's trying to make the best of this and treat it like an opportunity, while being fully aware that some of her teammates don't seem trustworthy at all. Not all of them, though. Jessica already has the trust and respect of Blackfire from their time together in Justice League Odyssey, and Catman seems like more of a neutral party that can go either way. And the last one from Rex 10, what do you think of the Emerald Knights of Earth 3? I think they're a big improvement on an old concept. The evil Green Lantern of Earth 3 used to just be one random guy who got his powers from a wizard, and I always hated the fact that his name was Power Ring. Changing it to the Emerald Knights lets them do a lot of world building and is just more interesting in general. We got a few here from Anthony Manns. Why didn't Alan Scott save Batman's parents, and do you think on some level he holds him responsible? Alan Scott was not Green Lantern when the Waynes were murdered. His career started in 1940 and ended in 1951 when the United States government forced the entire JSA into retirement when they refused to reveal their identities. Alan and the rest of the JSA didn't come back until after the next generation of heroes had already established themselves, and by then we already had Batman. Bruce actually has an old photograph of his father with Alan Scott. He was a member of the Junior Lantern fan club and couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old at the time. So Bruce understands that Alan couldn't have done anything about his parents' death, and actually has a soft spot in his heart for Alan since this was his father's hero. What do you imagine the Green Lantern of a 60s or 70s Elseworld to be like? I think Grant Morrison answered that question for us when they created the Magic Lantern of Earth 47. He hasn't had a whole lot of development, but we're meant to project every groovy hippie stereotype onto his character. For a much more detailed look at what a 1970s Green Lantern would be like, just take a look at the early career of John Stewart, who first appeared in 1972. Would things be better or worse if a Lantern replaced Dr. Manhattan in his universe? If you replace Dr. Manhattan with a Green Lantern, then most of Watchmen's story falls apart. Not only is a Green Lantern nowhere near as powerful as Dr. Manhattan, they're also not so detached from their own humanity that they'd see things the way Dr. Manhattan does. And even if you want to go with the idea that the Green Lantern in this scenario would adopt similar qualities because they're now the focus of a meta commentary on superheroes, the fact that the ring can always be taken off would prevent the Lantern from losing their connection to humanity. Basically, the story of Watchmen only happens if the one superpowered person in the world is a walking nuclear deterrent who's disconnected from what it means to be human. Anyone more down to earth than that would have an easier time keeping the trust of the public while maintaining relationships with the other heroes. Last one from Anthony Manns. With characters like Dr. 13 in the universe, is it possible for someone to overpower a Lantern by not believing in their power? So, Dr. 13 is a character who investigates supernatural phenomena, but doesn't believe magic is real. He's like Scully from the X-Files. Can that denial give him an edge over people with superpowers? Maybe in a metatextual story that specifically talks about the nature of reality as it applies to superhero comics, like Dr. 13 Architecture and Morality. But outside of that, no. There are a lot of high-profile characters, like Batman and Mr. Terrific, who do not believe in magic, but are still vulnerable to magic-based opponents. If anything, Dr. 13's denialism is the exact opposite of what you'd need to overpower a Lantern. There are really only two ways to trivialize the effect that these powers have on you. Either be so absurdly powerful that they can't harm you, or embrace the power so thoroughly that you can command it not to harm you. In the first issue of the Jeremy Adams run of Green Lantern, someone shot a ringless Hal Jordan with a beam of willpower energy, and it didn't harm him at all because Hal bent the energy to his own will. Alaskan Reaper wants to know, what do you think makes Green Lantern as a superhero and overall concept stand out compared to other heroes in both Marvel and DC? Infinite creativity and infinite versatility are baked right into the Green Lantern concept. You've got a superpower that can do literally anything you can imagine and can be tailored to each individual person who uses it. Then you give that power to thousands of people from all across the universe, opening up the potential for literally any story you can possibly imagine. Any genre, any location, any subject matter at all. If you can imagine it existing somewhere in an infinite universe, Green Lantern can be part of it. Most other franchises have to invent entire multiverses just to reach the level of storytelling potential that comes standard with Green Lantern. Tyler Brown says, I came across this picture and was hoping you could do a deep dive on it. Barbara Gordon is a Green Lantern, Stephanie Brown is a Blue Lantern, Damian is a Red Lantern. What is this all about? So Batgirl number 24 came out in 2009 and was the final issue of the Batgirl solo series written by Brian Q. Miller, starring Stephanie Brown. The story had Stephanie get dosed with a drug made from the Black Mercy, an alien plant that traps a person inside their own fantasy. We're shown 7 splash pages of Stephanie inhabiting different dream worlds that are all based on stories that Brian Q. Miller wanted to write but never got the chance. He describes this page as the Blackest Night tie-in I never got to write. Blackest Night was already more than halfway over when this Batgirl series started, so there really wasn't an opportunity to do a tie-in without derailing the book's opening arc. So unlike some other pages in this issue, which depict stories that would have happened if the series hadn't been cancelled, the Bat family with lantern rings is something we might have seen if this Batgirl book had started sooner. Also, shout out to the Tumblr blog DC Women Kicking Ass for collecting Brian Q. Miller's notes and panel descriptions of these splash pages. There'll be a link in the description, go check them out. Tyler Sayes asks, so between making all these ring prototypes, when did the Guardians build the Manhunters? The Guardians built the Manhunters after they purged themselves of emotions leading to the creation of the first ring, but Krona didn't go along with it. He believed there was no merit to an emotionless robot army built by emotionless people, which is why he kept his emotions and built his gauntlet. And it sounds like Krona has the right idea, except that he decided to prove his point by reprogramming the Manhunters and causing them to massacre the inhabitants of Sector 666, leaving Atrocitus as the only survivor of an entire sector. So the Manhunters came between the first ring and Krona's gauntlet. Sergio Ruiz says, I always wondered which Lantern Corps Wolfgame Grimmer from Monster would best fit into, or Toguro from Yu Yu Hakusho. Also, would you think Kuwabara is an anime version of Guy Gardner? Kuwabara is extremely Guy Gardner. Watch Yu Yu Hakusho, everybody. Grimmer would probably be an Indigo Lantern, since he was forced to undergo procedures to dull his emotions, and wants nothing more than to get them back. Most Indigo rings go to people who need to learn how to feel feelings, so it would probably help him a lot. Although since those feelings really are still buried deep down inside of him, I could also see Ultraviolet dredging up at least some of what's been repressed. Mike Warren asks, curious how you feel about the Guardians being portrayed as a largely malevolent group over the last decade or so. I personally like the idea of Guardians being a group of beings who evolved past petty things like the need for power and control, and are trying to be an example of what we could be, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. I think it's harder to portray the Guardians as altruistic figures because of how long they've been around. They are billions of years old, and spent a large portion of that time with a strict policy of not getting directly involved with anything. And what makes it even more difficult is that they have to live and think on a scale that is so far beyond everyone else that they are, by default, always going to be out of touch with the universe that they're trying to help. An extreme amount of power, plus an inability to relate to the people they've sworn to protect, it makes sense that they'd eventually go too far. Ironically, having to deal with individual rogue Guardians like Krona or Scar is probably the best way to keep the rest of the Guardians in check, because it gives them an incredibly clear example of what lines not to cross. Zaire Bassoon asks, does Amon Sur know about the Indigo Lanterns? He was basically obsessed with trying to get his father's ring back from Hal, and finding out that Amon Sur created an entire corps, a hostile takeover of the Indigo Lanterns would be inevitable. What do you think could be done with that plotline, or where do you think it could go? He does not know about them. Abin Sur kept his work with Nostromo and the Indigos a secret from everyone. On top of that, Abin Sur died shortly after the end of the Sinestro Corps War, so he didn't live long enough to see the Indigo Lanterns reveal themselves to the other corps for the first time. The last time we saw Abin Sur was during Blackest Night, when he was a Black Lantern, but there are a million ways he could come back to life. I think it would be cool to see the Indigos try to bring him into the fold, and take it upon themselves to reform the son of their founder, Abin Sur. I'd love to see Abin Sur try to social engineer his way into taking command of the Indigo tribe, though I don't know how you get around the fact that an Indigo ring should be able to easily neutralize him right away. Maybe there's some kind of failsafe that keeps the ring from affecting him, since his genetic profile is so close to Abin's or something. I don't know, but either way, I think you're right. It seems like the obvious choice to pair him up with the Indigos for an arc. Tomaz Alexander asks, Soul's Red Lanterns or Bun's Sinestro? Oh god. Okay, if I have to pick, I think I have to follow the same logic I used when I ranked my top 10 favorite Lantern runs. When I made that list, these two series were neck and neck, but I gave Cullen Bunn's Sinestro the edge because it achieved similar heights as Charles Soule's Red Lanterns without the advantage of any human main characters. Booty Capital wants to know, which design do you prefer, Parallax Hal Jordan or Parallax Sinestro? I love them both and they're my personal favorite superhero supervillain costumes. It's a very tough call, since the design is so strong and looks great in both cases, but I've gotta go with Sinestro. It looks so cool in yellow, and I think the white streak in the front of Sinestro's hair really completes the whole thing. Tom Halloran asks, did you ever reread Morrison's run after your last video on it? Any updated thoughts on it? Unfortunately not. I don't usually have a lot of time to reread a run unless I'm planning to make a video about it. Which, honestly, maybe I should just do that. I'll put a Grant Morrison video on the calendar so I can finally allow myself to give their Green Lantern series another shot. Heath wants to know, do you think something like Green Lantern Green Arrow could be made in today's climate? With a left-wing and right-wing character teaming up and working through their differences and maybe coming to see each other's perspectives. If so, what characters could be used for this? Personally, I think it could be dicey. What made that run of Green Lantern Green Arrow so unique is that, at that point, superhero comics didn't generally talk about controversial real-world issues. I would argue that plenty of modern comics talk about the kinds of topics that were central to Green Lantern Green Arrow all the time. The biggest difference between then and now is the environment the comics are being released into. On one hand, these sorts of comics come out so often that you may not even notice them anymore unless they get a lot of coverage, or speak to something that's meaningful to you. But they do tend to be very impactful to those who they do resonate with. On the other side of things, there are people who explode with rage at anything that dares to talk about an aspect of society and culture that impacts people's lives. At a certain point, if you're going to tell these kinds of stories, you just have to be okay with the fact that some people are going to blindly rail against it for allegedly pushing an agenda that commits the sin of being different from the agenda that they want to see pushed. Most creators seem like they're fine with that, but the real question is whether or not the publisher would stick to their guns. There's a real temptation to hedge their bets and tell socially conscious stories that land somewhere in the middle, deeming both sides to be a little bit wrong, which ultimately neuters the whole point of telling the story in the first place. So we may not currently have a single Green Lantern series dedicated to telling these sorts of stories, but we do have arcs like Brother's Keeper, which talked at length about hate crimes. We have Far Sector talking about police brutality and the systemic nature of societal problems. We have the upcoming Alan Scott book, which is going to star a closeted gay man living in a world where coming out could cause him to lose everything. I think Green Lantern Green Arrow started something that never stopped. Masquerade Noir asks, what do you think would be an interesting story for Jessica? I think it would be interesting for her to meet with either the mobster from her backstory or one of his relatives and forgive them. You know, rereading Green Lantern Circle of Fire made me wonder what might happen if Jessica found out that the rings can expel your negative feelings. Sorrow, anger, self-doubt, fear. If there was a chance that the ring could literally remove her anxiety, would she do it? And where would it go once it's free of her? How would a change this big impact Jessica's life? And if it came right down to it, would she be willing to take it all back? Would she willingly choose to reclaim the feelings she released into the world if it meant saving others? If you want more context for what I'm talking about, I highly recommend you check out the GL June crossover I did with the Lantern Cast, Multiverse Musings, and Podcast of Oa, talking all about the Circle of Fire storyline. 2 here from Caesar. Do you think Arisia, Nort, or Kilowog could hold their own solo series? I think Kilowog might be the only alien Green Lantern who's popular enough to support his own series, though I don't know for how long. The most popular alien character in the entire franchise is Sinestro, and his series only lasted 2 years. I think an interesting experiment would be to bring back the Green Lantern core book, but instead of centering it on 1 or 2 human characters, make Kilowog the protagonist, and fill out the supporting cast with all of the most popular alien Green Lanterns, like Arisia, Nort, Mogo, Saranac Natu. See if their popularity, plus the Green Lantern Corps branding, is enough to keep the book going. Is Sector 2814 close to Sinestro's sector, since all the lanterns there tend to have a close relation with at least one Earth lantern? It's not. Sinestro is from the planet Korrigar in Sector 1417, which is quite a ways away from Earth and Sector 2814. The reason they cross over so much is actually Abin Sur's fault. He and Sinestro were close friends, to the point that Sinestro even fell in love with Abin's sister, Erin. Abin had been growing increasingly paranoid, obsessing over the prophecy of the Blackest Night, and then eventually went missing. Sinestro went looking for his friend, tracking down his ring, and that's how he met Hal Jordan. Since Hal was Abin's successor, Sinestro decided to train him, and because they began to trust each other, Sinestro let Hal see what he'd been doing to, quote-unquote, improve the planet Korrigar, which led to Hal and the Corps putting a stop to Sinestro's tyranny. Sinestro has been a mortal enemy of the Earth Lanterns ever since, and considering his reputation on Korrigar and throughout the Corps, anyone who inherits his ring understandably gets a lot of unwanted attention. Katma-Tui and Saranac Natu were both shunned by their people for accepting the ring, and because superhero comics are soap operas, they both found love with lanterns from Earth, further complicating the drama between the two worlds. And lastly, Aranya wants to know, what do you think life would be like for Hal and the other lanterns in the Marvel Universe? Hal would get a job at Stark Industries testing experimental Iron Man armor. Joe would become a mutant rights activist. John would go into space and investigate the Nova Corps to see if that's a group they should try working with. Kyle would get a job working for Marvel Comics, which does exist within the Marvel Universe. Heroes like the Fantastic Four license their adventures so that an in-universe version of Marvel can publish comics about them. This is actually a major plot point in Dan Slott's run on She-Hulk, since those comics are all technically admissible in court. Simon would be absolutely fascinated by Ghost Rider's ability to transform any vehicle into Hellfire form, and he'd form a strong bond with Robbie Reyes. Jessica would fit nicely into Captain Marvel's circle of super friends. She'd get along particularly well with Kamala, and would endlessly tell Carol anecdotes about Wonder Woman, no matter how many times Carol asks her to stop. Guy would walk right into Avengers headquarters and demand to be the new team leader before being thrown out. He'd get mad and call them a discount version of the Justice League, and that would inspire him to make a new Justice League that would, in his mind, rival the Avengers. It would end up being kinda like the Justice League International or West Coast Avengers, and Guy would be the team leader, of course. And that's it! All questions have been answered. If you have anything to add to any of these topics, or you have your own questions that you'd like answered next time, don't hesitate to write it all down in the comment section of this video. I look forward to seeing what you have to say. So until next time, thank you for taking the time to watch. My name is Dan. We'll talk again soon.